Welcome back to segment 2 of Citizens Forum, being filmed on May 14th, Election Day, in the beautiful Memorial Arena in downtown Victoria. I'd like to thank our volunteer crew who make this all possible, and the Shaw staff as well. Our guest in this segment is Michelle Mulder. I hope I'm saying that right. And she has written a very beautiful and attractive book called Pedal It. And we're going to be talking about bicycling today. And Michelle, I think I asked you what you'd like to talk about, and you said kind of appropriate technology, so away you go.
When I was writing this book, my main idea was to focus on how we often use technology that's much stronger than we really need. For example, to go from point A to B, we often use a car when really it's not that far and we could just use a bicycle. And as I was putting together this book, I actually struggled to figure out what my central concept was. And when I figured out the idea of appropriate technology, it all just seemed to come together.
Okay, so what's the book about?
It's about bicycles, and it's divided into 4 parts. The first chapter is the history of the bicycle. The second chapter is the science behind bicycles, which was interesting to write because I never imagined myself writing about science. And the third chapter is about how bicycles are used to transport people from point A to B in different countries. In many countries where automobiles are just way too expensive, bicycles are used far more than cars. And so it's full of interesting pictures of just the kinds of things that people can actually move on a bicycle. Or the number of people, for example. And the last section is bicycle-powered machines and how bicycles can be used and pedal power can be used for things that we would never imagine, like pedal-powered medical centrifuges, for example, to diagnose iron deficiency anemia.
So, I mean, we're at a time in human history when the use of fossil fuels is threatening to destroy a large part of the planet through climate change and really make for some difficult times ahead. And here we have the bicycle, which seems to be a big part of the solution. If you combine bicycles and good public transit, we could probably do away with 90% of automobile use. So how do we start to get from here to there?
I think a big part of the whole situation is simply education. We could, of course, improve the cycling infrastructure and make sure the cycling lanes through Victoria are consistent, for example. But I think the farthest reaching change would be cycling education both for cyclists and for car drivers. I think that would make it much safer to cycle, and I think it would make it much more accessible and appealing for people in general to ride a bike.
So what kind of education?
Well, I was actually talking this over with a fellow cyclist friend of mine who's in his 80s and very respected in the cycling community. And one thing he suggested that I'd never thought of before was actually including bicycle education in the schools. When we go through schools, a lot of the skills that we learn are tested by the idea of, will this be useful after we finish school? And often in physical education classes, we do things that we won't necessarily be doing after high school.
All of school is, it's like if it's useful after school, it's not in school, right?
Well, yes, fair enough.
But that's another story.
So one thing that my friend was saying, which I thought would be a great idea, would be to include bicycle education and rules of the road and safety and that kind of thing within the school system, in the PE class or wherever it might fit best. And I know some schools are actually doing this, which is very exciting, and I just wish all schools would do that.
And how about education for drivers as well, I guess? Although, of course, if it's in the schools, the same people, well, no, there won't be so many drivers because in the future there's going to be a lot fewer cars. When you talk about bicycling infrastructure, like, it is dangerous out there when you're on a bike. I mean, there's a lot of close calls. I had an accident a while ago, and after I did, I was surprised at how many people told me, yeah, you know, they've also had a bike accident in the last few years. Now, I think there are things that can be done, like for example, separated areas for the bicycles, not just a white line on the side of the road, which is about the best we have here. And that's not bad. I mean, when there is a bike lane, you are, I think, a lot safer. But people are talking about completely separated lanes for a bike. How does that work?
I think it depends a lot on the cyclist. I'm perfectly happy in my own cycling lane without the barrier. I actually think it promotes, this might sound very idealist, but I think it actually promotes car drivers and cyclists to respect each other. Which, yes, it does sound idealist, but once again, I think it goes back to the whole education component. If drivers are more respectful of cyclists and cyclists are more respectful of drivers, then we don't need separate barriers. And also, I think the idea of adding separate barriers instead of or before the whole education component just becomes another reason for the government to say, no, we just don't have enough money for that. I think ultimately an education program would be much less expensive than reformatting the entire city for bike paths.
So the subtitle of your book, Pedal It, is How Bicycles Are Changing the World. How are they changing the world?
I think it comes back to the whole fossil fuel thing and how we often use fossil fuels when we don't really need them. I read a statistic recently saying that 25% of all car trips are within 2 kilometers of point A, which basically means that it is fairly reasonable to do on a bicycle given appropriate weather conditions. And 50% of car trips are within 5 kilometers of home. 5 kilometers is also a very reasonable bicycling distance. So I think bicycles are changing the world because we're actually realizing just how useful they are. And a lot of the fossil fuels we do burn can be avoided completely if we just use the technology that's appropriate for what we're doing. And it's not just a matter of what we're doing here in so-called developed countries like Canada. In a lot of other countries, pedal power is serving other purposes that we never would have necessarily imagined. I mentioned the pedal-powered medical centrifuge earlier. And that's a situation in India where people are starting to use pedal power to do something for which they used to rely on electricity, which of course isn't always available. So I'm not advocating that everybody replace their light switch with a pedal-powered generator, but I think there are a lot of situations where we're used to burning fossil fuels where we could simply just use simpler technology, not to mention the health benefits that are involved in cycling.
So if, let's say here in Victoria, we want to see more people riding bikes, which I would really like to see because it's healthy, it's good for you, and it's good for the environment. So we just want to see a doubling or quadrupling of the number of people, especially making short trips. Do you have any idea of how to make that happen? Is it advertising, education?
I think education, of course, plays a large part. Advertising also plays a large part, I think. There are cycling maps available in Victoria, but a lot of times people who are new to cycling don't necessarily know what the cycling routes are. And there are definitely routes or roads in Victoria that I would never, ever cycle on, especially not with my small child. But there are plenty of ways to avoid those routes and get to where I need to go. So I think advertising the cycling routes is very important. But most of all, education and a sort of promotion of the idea of cycling as a good thing rather than a dangerous or a foolhardy thing. I've been told by people that it's absolutely ludicrous for me to be riding a bike at all, never mind with my child. Whereas I often see it as absolutely ludicrous to be driving 2 kilometers instead of riding a bike. So it's all a matter of opinion, and I think if the cycling voices can be raised a bit or listened to more, that would make all the difference.
You mentioned when the weather is appropriate. When I was riding, and I haven't since the accident, which was about a year ago. But I would ride literally 365 days a year. You know, if there was snow on the ground, I wouldn't.
Mm-hmm.
But even a bit icy, I still could, and it seemed safe enough. Maybe I was crazy, but with decent clothes, and not that expensive, but a pair of rain pants, a pair of rubber boots,
Mm-hmm.
and a good rain jacket, and you know, a few other things. There's waterproof gloves, and you can buy a bag that covers your backpack to keep that dry. And I was very, very happy, you know, cycling in very heavy rain. And yet a few years before that, I was watching people cycle in the winter, and I think, are you crazy? But once I started to do it, I loved it, and I never would have stopped, except luckily I got hit by a bus, which has you know, made me walk, and the walking is even better.
Yeah.
But bicycling is great, and you know, we should, you know, it would be nice if it was a little bit safer, if everybody was doing more of it. You mentioned dangerous streets. What do you think are the most dangerous?
I would never ride along Bay.
Okay.
Maybe 1 or 2 blocks, but that's about it.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the ones that are most dangerous depends a lot on the time of day. Shelburne can also be a bit hair-raising at times. Mostly just the big streets where people are in a real hurry. And I mean, that also includes cyclists. I think being in a hurry is just bad for everybody on the road, whether you're a cyclist or a car driver.
And when I'm driving a car, I'm a crazy car driver. When I'm on my bike, I'm a crazy bike driver. So, and most people are probably like that. But you know, it can all work out. So, I'd like to talk a bit about the book. Before we do that, is there anything you'd like to say just about the general issue of biking and what we've discussed?
No, I think mostly just the focus on education.
So
is
there's 4 chapters. Who thought this up anyway is chapter 1. How did we get here from there is chapter 2. On the Move is chapter 3. And Pedaling for Change is chapter 4. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about one of those 4 parts of the book.
I think for me, the history of bicycling was very interesting, just even as far as a sort of sociocultural study, because bicycles started off being things for very well-off men in Europe to use sort of as toys.
Okay.
And then when the car came along, they sort of fell out of favor, and the car was the new status symbol. And then in hard times, bicycles became more common, and they've kind of gone up and down in popularity and prestige ever since. And many people say it's sort of becoming fashionable again to ride a bike, depending on where you live. And so that to me is very interesting, just to see how the same device, basically bicycles haven't changed in more than 100 years, has had such different esteem depending on what's going on in the world around it, and yet consistently bicycles are being used and continue to be used.
So when were bicycles invented?
Most people would probably say around the 1860s or 70s. The
150, 100.
Yeah, the bicycle that we sort of know today. It had its precursors earlier, of course, and in the early 1700s somebody invented a walking machine, or Laufmaschine as they say in German, and it was basically pretty much like the pedalless Strider bikes that you see today that toddlers sometimes use. Training wheels used to be the thing, and now
So more like a scooter?
it looks exactly like a small version of a bike, but without pedals, and the kids just run along instead of pedaling. So that was sort of the precursor to the bicycle, but it took another 100 years or so for inventors to add other things like pedals and brakes and other details like that. Yes, exactly.
Great. So I was surprised to see under the history, when I looked in the book, the Wright brothers were bicycle mechanics.
Mm-hmm.
I think I may have known that. So how do we kind of build bicycling into our everyday lives? Do you cover that at all in the book, or?
I do to some extent, mostly in the last chapter, because it's a book directed towards children, although hopefully it'll be interesting for everyone. And one thing I found really empowering as a kid was being able to get myself places on my bicycle, and so I do focus on that in the last chapter. But I think it's actually a lot easier to incorporate cycling than we might otherwise imagine. I think, as you say, with the right gear, it's just a matter of jumping on your bike instead of jumping into your car on your next trip to the grocery store or the corner store or whatever. And I think maybe a lot of people assume that it has to be a huge, okay, I'll sell my car and there's no more fossil fuels for me kind of shift. But I think even if we doubled the number of times per week that we use a bicycle, that would make a huge difference. Apparently in the United States, 1% of all 1% of all trips from point A to B are done by bicycle. And if that were doubled, that would be a huge savings in fossil fuel.
Well, we've got to start. As I've said a few times, we're filming this on Election Day here in BC. So maybe the next government, whomever it may be, is going to hire a bicycle consultant and try to really make bicycling and bicycles a bigger part of our society. I think that would be a wonderful thing to do. I think a lot of people would appreciate it. And I hope the bicycle community, you said one of the most important things is education. I hope the bicycle community can come together and make a DVD about the education that you think people should have about bikes, and we can show it on community television right across the province maybe. I think that would be very important.
That would be fabulous.
So Michelle Mulder, the author of Pedal It, How Bicycles Are Changing the World. We've got a minute left. Any last comment?
No, thank you very, very much for having me today. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thanks for watching this segment of Citizens Forum. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.
Welcome to segment 3 of Citizens Forum. Our guest in this segment is Hendrik de Pagter. I've known Hendrik for many years. I think we were both in the Green Party together quite a few years ago. We were a little bit active in that. And you were for a while, about 5 or 6 years ago maybe, you were a Sunday morning guest on Sean Holman's show on CFAX Radio for a short time. I thought you were the best prognosticator on that program, so of course after a few months I guess you were off of it.
That makes two of us who thought I was the best.
So we're going to start off by talking about the election, which is taking place today, and just your take on what's going on.
Well, I think it is time for a change. We've had 12 years of the Liberals, and I think that's enough for any party to stick in the people's craws. And certainly the Liberal Party has changed BC in dramatic ways that I think a majority of British Columbians don't agree with. If we would combine the NDP vote and the Green vote, we would have a substantial number of people who would say that the present course is the wrong course. So I think we're in for a change, and I suspect that given our first past the post electoral system, that it will be Tweedledee as opposed to Tweedledum, and which is my cynical way of saying that we'll re-elect the NDP, but in substance, the problems that mark our economy and our environment here in BC won't substantially change. I think there is some optimism that the Green Party's vote will be substantially increased in percentage. Certainly in the southern half of Vancouver Island, there is a possibility that one or two Greens will actually win. I would certainly like to see that, as it's my sincere belief that that's the only thing that would hold the NDP's feet to the fire with regards to climate change and other environmental questions. So I foresee some change, a small victory, a small majority victory for the NDP.
But you don't see the NDP really being too much different than the Liberals, and if that is what you think, I agree with it.
Well, you know, I think it's rather demeaning after 12 years of continued welfare policy to offer people on welfare $20 as an increase in order to meet the rising cost of living. This plan by the NDP really is insulting, and it perpetuates the poverty industry, which is the basic structure of most of our income support programs here in Canada. So what's the point of that? I really don't see how poor people are going to be uplifted under an NDP government. I also see that the NDP are obsessed, as are the Liberals, with pushing gas pipelines to the coast and shipping out liquid natural gas as fast as they can pump it to markets that are insecure, that are already adequately supplied, and to markets that are discovering their own sources of natural gas that they can frack if they want to. So really, I see the NDP being trapped in the same resource lust game that the Liberals are, except that they are not as beholden to the oil companies as the Liberals are. They are supported by resource extraction unions. This is their bread and butter vote. They are going to need to promote industry which promotes resource extraction unions. So they're in a bind, and I don't see that as progressive for the province of British Columbia, nor solving our problems.
Did you say that the NDP's position is that people on welfare, I guess single person on welfare, will get an extra $20 a month? Is
correct? They will go from about $609 to, I imagine, $630.
Okay. As you say, that
which is
sounds
60% below the poverty rate as it is.
Yeah.
If you're on disability benefits, roughly $900 a month, you're 40% below the poverty rate. So our welfare rates are scandalous and are not conducive to social harmony. In fact, they create more expenditure than the problems they solve. We know that any person on the street is costing our economy $50,000 a year in extra policing, social and medical services, compared to housing that same person for around $25,000 a year. So why are we incurring this expense? I, as a cheap Dutchman, am offended by the fact that they're spending my tax dollars on keeping people on the street. I want them housed properly and taken care of because it's cheaper and it's the right thing to do.
I would agree 100%. Is there any chance the NDP will do that?
I think the NDP will incrementally try to assist people who are disadvantaged, but they're still committed to the poverty maintenance industry here through the panoply of provincial and federal income support programs. The Green Party's platform of a guaranteed adequate annual livable income is far superior in terms of providing adequate income and also reducing overhead caused by this multitude of programs, federal and provincial. Nor does an income support program reduce the possibility of adjusting the income tax indexing so that richer people who can afford it and who can contribute more to the welfare of the province are taxed accordingly. And certainly the corporations who've had a pretty good deal over the last few years could stand to pay a bit more to help the people who keep their industries running.
Should we be building more social housing?
Absolutely. It's cheaper to take care of people and put them in adequate housing than it is not to.
Have you heard of the book called The Spirit Level?
The Spirit Level?
Yes.
No.
This is a book, we talked about it a few months ago, a little bit on the show, and basically it says that if you just reduce the income inequality in a society, virtually every measure that you take of that society improves, from health to crime to education to just almost name it, dozens of different measures. Simply by reducing income inequality, everything gets better. Mm-hmm. And I would love to see that start to happen instead of us going in the opposite direction.
Well, the income gap used to be a lot smaller. Traditionally, Canada was closer to the income gap of Europe, roughly 1 in 12, 1 to 15. between the average worker and the average managerial salary. Now that has gone to 1 in 400 or to the obscene levels that you see in America. So we're down a path that is very similar to the American path.
You wanted to talk a bit about messaging about
Right.
this election, so let's go there.
Well, I'm a little bit concerned that it's really boiled down to very simplistic messaging. The NDP are promising change. Everyone wants change. That's a no-brainer. We saw that in 2008 in the United States. And they're wanting also to message that they're not going to be scary socialist hordes stealing money from the wealthy by saying, one step at a time, gradual change. Don't fear that we're going to overturn the apple cart, when clearly what we do require, I'm going to say, is almost revolutionary change in terms of the economic structure of our society. If we're going to survive the changes that are coming with global warming, climate change, and reduction of resources. We see all kinds of consequences of reduction of resources, including resource wars, water wars, fish wars, and the steady killing of these resources. So I don't see any fundamental grappling with these issues. The message is, on the NDP's part, trust us, we're going to change nice and slow. And with the Liberals, they have a classic Liberal message, strong economy, secure future, whatever it is. Basically, they're playing a strong daddy who will take care of you in turbulent times. And they've added a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, which is the liquid natural gas plan, which is going to make them wealthier than Alberta. And we know how well Alberta has done. They have accumulated $13 billion in their heritage fund in a period of 20 years when the in a period of 40 years when the Norwegians have done $350 billion in the space of 20 years. So the Albertans have done a really lousy job of saving, but they've done an excellent job of turning northern Alberta into something resembling a scene out of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. It's Mordor up there, and all the pipelines are basically a metastasis of this cancerous development of oil. And I've gone through one national newspaper, the Globe and Mail, for the month of January and half of February, and I've culled something like 40 articles that I've brought with me here describing the crisis of moving oil from the tar sands. So the messages are too simple. No one's looking at health care, no one's looking at poverty, no one's really looking at education. It's all about, I'm strong daddy, even though my name is Christy Clark, and trust me, I'm gentle mommy, going to change step by step. And I think these are simplistic messages that demean the intellect of the voter and don't engage the voter.
So how do we, my push is for basically a more democratic political system where on the issue of taxation, the government would, put out a lot of information, honest information about what's going on, how our taxes compare to various other countries in the world, how the rich and the poor do in taxation. Give us information and then find out what we, the people, want, and then try to move in that direction. That's what I would like to see happen. Is that similar to what you would like to see?
Well, sure. Anything that engages the citizens in true consultation is to be appreciated. My concern is that there are no legal constraints for either federal or provincial governments to really do that. They do have an obligation to do so with the First Nations under the 1763 Royal Proclamation, under the BNA Act, under the repatriation of the Constitution, and under UN law. They are obliged to consult with and discuss all of these measures with the First Nations before they undertake them. And the federal government is planning something like $650 billion worth of energy and mining projects over the next 10 years, most of which will occur on First Nations land. and they are not really being consulted, I really see the best hope for Canadians to have a voice is by supporting the First Nations who are saying we're tired of being neglected and we need to have our sovereignty validated, and we need to be economic and political partners in all of these processes.
Shouldn't the rest of us also have a voice, though? And shouldn't
We
the rest
should
of
have
us
a
also
voice,
be
but
sovereign?
we are not protected any longer. You have a federal parliament which prorogues, you have a federal parliament which introduces omnibus bills and limits discussion. You have a federal parliament steeped in secrecy. They muzzle their scientists. You have a provincial government here which sits maybe 3 months of the year. Parliament means parlement, we speak. Well, you don't speak if you're not sitting. So we have governments which are increasingly finding ways to discourage discussion, discourage the gathering of information of what the people want, tell the people what a good plan is, and impose it regardless of what the people say. This is a typically Canadian way of going about things, is to sound the people out and then do what you want.
So ask the people what they want, and then the government does what it wants.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that's what we have to move away from.
Sure.
Yeah.
We do, and as long as we don't have an electoral system that promotes diversity of opinion, you're going to have these monolithic blocks that start to resemble each other, because that's the only way you can gain the 5 or 10% that float around in the middle to decide an election outcome. You don't have diversity of opinion. I'd just like to point out that in the country of my birth in Holland, you have 150 seats in their national parliament. And if you get 0.66% of the popular vote, you get a seat in parliament. So the Animal Rights Party has 2 seats in the federal parliament. What that means is that there's pressure on the Socialist Party, on the Green Left Party, and on other political formations to upgrade their policies on animal rights. And as long as those policies are not moving, then the Dutch have the option to vote for an animal rights party to keep that issue alive and in Parliament. We don't have that structure because we don't have proportional representation. And the only proportional representation that we had in terms of federal funding of parties has been stripped away by Harper and his paranoia that there be a well-organized opposition to his mad plans.
You know, and that happened almost without any discussion. We did have, for about 10 years in Canada, a bit less, a system where the public largely funded the political parties, so they didn't have to go to the banksters, the 1%ers, the oil companies, and the pharmaceutical
corporations
companies.
and the unions.
Yeah, in order to get money to exist.
That's right.
Harper got rid of that, so now once again, the money comes only from those with wealth, or largely comes.
Right.
And is that is not a step forward for our democracy.
Now, I'm privileged enough to be able to fund the party of my belief to the limit that I'm allowed to, but many Canadians are not in that boat, and I would be happy for my taxes to go towards representing the diversity of opinion here in Canada.
We talked a little bit about the group called Lead Now.
Right.
And maybe we've only got 2 minutes left. Maybe you
Well,
can
this
just say
comes
a
back
little.
to the messaging, and it's not only the political parties' messaging, but I was apprised of a Lead Now email out that went out about 4 days ago, noting there were 5 days to the election. It's closer than you think. And then in the bold copy, the BC Liberals were bolded 3 times. The BC NDP were bolded 4 times. The BC Conservatives and the BC Greens were not bolded at all. And in the actual regular print, there was mention that of the 4 criteria that Lead Now was discussing based upon the Pembina Institute's good work on where the parties stand with regards to 4 environmental issues, only the Green Party was moving forward in all 4. The NDP moved back in 1 step with liquefied natural gas. So they didn't really present that information in the graphic that was provided by the Pembina Institute, and the actual structure was saying when you look at the 2 parties that are likely to be elected, so again there is this centripetal force of looking at only two parties as being the natural governing model. Why would you look at the best policies when they're never going to get anywhere? So instead of Lead Now saying, let's lead now and let's actually promote the party with the best policies, and they provided the links to that information, they didn't. They promoted the NDP and to a
Hendrik,
lesser
we're going
extent
to have
the
to
Liberals.
leave it at that. We're out of time. Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
so much for allowing me to rant. I
Yeah,
really
yeah.
appreciate it.
And I appreciated it too.
Cheers.
Thanks for watching this segment of Citizens Forum.
That was fun.
Let's do it again. That was great.
Thank you so much.